Welcome, welcome friends. Patrina here with Homegrown Florida. In my past Q&A sessions, we have talked about everything from starting a new garden, cultivating and caring for your garden, when to harvest, how to grow fruit trees, and today we're talking about the last step in gardening, which is how do you store and preserve that harvest so it lasts even longer. So the first question comes from Kelly and Janice, and they were both asking what methods I use to preserve my food. And so I have a little bit of how I do everything right here. Oh, I forgot one thing. I almost forgot one of the simplest ways, which is freezing. So let's walk through the different ways, and I'm going to walk them through the easiest way to preserve to probably what I would consider the hardest way to preserve. So the very easiest way to preserve is curing. And curing is what's happening here. So I have a pumpkin. This is a Seminole pumpkin. I have some sweet potatoes. And then right here, I have some dried beans. And these are not canned. They're just placed in the jar. They are dried. Each one of these are dried, allowed to sit either at room temperature or in the heat to preserve themselves. This is by far the easiest way. Now, the other ones that you can do this with are garlic, shallots, onions, potatoes, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, winter squash, and then of course any kind of dried item like a dry bean, dry pea. The next easiest way is the one I almost forgot, which is freezing. This is my celery harvest, which I literally cut it from the plant, chopped it up, put it in a vacuum seal bag, and froze it. Now, if you want your vegetables to last longer in the freezer, you will probably want to blanch them. Most vegetables are better if they're blanched, and blanched just means that you're going to take the raw vegetable, you're going to boil it in hot water for anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and then you're going to shock it into some cold water, dry it off, and then do the same thing, vacuum seal it. That helps keep its structure, color, and things like that. Now, freezing is not perfect when it comes out. This celery is not going to be crunchy like regular celery, but it's great to use in stir fries, in soups, in pasta dishes, anything where you would be looking for cooked celery. The next way to preserve is fermentation. And I don't do a lot of fermentation because I'm not super crazy about the taste, but my husband does love sauerkraut, so I have been fermenting sauerkraut. This is cabbage from the garden. It's chopped up into whatever thickness you like. He prefers a rather thicker sauerkraut, so it's chunkier. And then I sprinkle on 1 to 2% salt. So this was, when I weighed it, 120 grams of cabbage. So I used 12 grams of salt. That would equal a 1% ratio. Now this usually only takes about 14 days to ferment, but I'm on day 30 and it is still fermenting. It's still not quite to that tangy taste that we like, but it's definitely making the corner. And all that I do after I chop it is I massage the leaves, and usually once you start packing it into the jar, there's enough liquid from the actual cabbage releasing its liquid from the salt to cover the cabbage that's in here. And then I just place a little pickle pebble. Anything, any kind of weight works. You could put a little shot glass in here, whatever you have, maybe a smaller mason jar filled with water or something, and put it in there. And then I like to use these fermentation vents. There's many different kinds of vents. This is a very cheap, easy way. You could just put like a cheesecloth or maybe a coffee filter or a tea towel over the top of it. But I like these because, one, you don't have to burp it. I don't have to worry about it getting wet or anything like that. I just put this on here. It has a tiny little nipple at the top that when the gases accumulate in here, it pops off and it releases the gas and it closes itself back up so that bacteria can't get in there. And that's fermentation. So that's like the third easiest way to preserve your harvest. Dehydrating would be the next easiest way, and I have 2 things that I have dehydrated here. I have a lot more, but this is just what I have available right now. This is my teas. It has pieces of fruit, it has herbs, It has different leaves, like I think it's got peach leaves and blackberry leaves and all kinds of stuff that I use to dehydrate, and that's what I make my teas with. This right here is shredded zucchini. I had so much zucchini, I did everything with it. This is really good to put like in your breads or to thicken soups or something like that. Now I also like to use my dehydrator for fruits, like if you're going to make fruit leather or you want a more chewier fruit snack. Like I like my apples, I like them more dehydrated than I like them freeze dried, but you know, it's up to you. It's individual taste. So those are different things that you can do with your dehydrator. The next level, I would say, in terms of how difficult it is going to be freeze drying. So I have some cauliflower rice here, and I have some raw eggs. The freeze dryer is new to me, although it is fast becoming my absolute favorite way to store fruits, vegetables, meals, eggs, dairy, desserts. I mean, pretty much anything. There's very few things that you can't freeze dry. Basically, I think the rule is you can freeze dry anything as long as it doesn't have an immense amount of sugar, like honey or actual sugar, or it doesn't have a lot of fat. So if you're going to do meats, you need to lean towards the lean meats or cut off the fats from the meats. But I mean, and you can do it raw, like these eggs are raw, or you can do it cooked. I haven't done cooked eggs, but I've done raw eggs. It's just so easy. You literally just lay them out on a tray and you stick them in the freeze dryer, and it runs for a considerable amount of time, maybe 24 to 35 hours, and then it comes out and you package it, and that is it. The really cool thing about freeze drying is that it holds a lot of the nutritional value, like 90+%. It's really crazy. And then the other thing, that the reason why I love it the most, is when you rehydrate the food, it tastes and has a texture very similar to fresh, right? It actually blows my mind. I absolutely love it. It is by far my easiest way for me to do preservation and then to want to eat the food once it's back to normal. The other cool thing is, besides canning, which we're going to talk about in a minute, this is one of the few types of preservation where you can do an entire meal, like a lasagna, and you can freeze dry it, and then you can rehydrate it later into an entire meal. You've probably seen these with like mountain meals or MREs or something, where they have freeze dried an entire meal and then you add water and you have a meal, like chicken and rice and all kinds of cool stuff. You can do that. Now our last one, which I just hinted on, is going to be canning. And there's two types of canning. There is water bath canning, and then there is pressure canning. So these two guys right here are water bath. This is pickles, which is preserved in vinegar, and then water bath. Water bath just means that you place this jar with its cap and its lid, and its screw top lid, underneath water, at least an inch of water above it, and you boil it for a certain period of time. It seals inside the jar and it heats everything to a certain degree temperature that will kill anything in it. Now this works for most of these items, like these pickles and these blackberry. This is blackberry jam, because the items in here have a high acidity. So technically cucumbers don't have a super high acidity, but when you mix it with vinegar, it increases the acidity, and that's why we can can this way. And blackberries have acidity, but a lot of the times I will add a little lemon juice just to notch it up, kick it up for the acidity. Just follow a proven and trusted recipe, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But these can be water bath. Now this right here is chicken. I have regular chicken. I have chicken and vegetable for chicken noodle soup. I have whole meals of beef stroganoff. I have all kinds of meals in a jar. And meat and most vegetables and some fruits, not all, but most fruits can be water bath. But the vegetables, the meat, and a couple of regular fruits do need to be pressure canned. And pressure canning is the hardest way to preserve. I wouldn't say it's the longest way to preserve. I really think that dehydrating and freeze drying is really the longest. It takes the longest amount of time, but there's so much hands-off time. With pressure canning, there is a lot of hands-on time. So you're preparing the meat and the vegetables, and there's certain ways that you have to do that. Like you have to peel tomatoes. Some things you can raw pack, other things you have to cook first. It is a process. And when the food comes out of the jar, it does have a softer quality to it. So if you're into soft foods, you'll love it. I like crisp foods, so I'm not always excited about eating my canned foods. I have learned of a little workaround in terms of making pressure canning a little bit easier. And that is I use an electric pressure canner. And that actually leads us into the next question. This question was from Denise asking my opinion on manual versus electric pressure canners. I had always used a manual canner. That's a stovetop canner with the dial in the you have to screw it into place, and it has a dial and it's got the weight and it jiggles, and you have to monitor the pressure and those kinds of things. I had one of those for years. Mine broke. And so when I was deciding whether I was going to replace it or whether I was going to move to an electric canner, I ended up going with an electric canner. And this is kind of a risque move. It's a little controversial because they haven't been extensively tested. But there's a lot more testing that's been coming out. And I really love Rose Red Homestead. She does testing on all these different electric canners. Mine in particular is a Presto electric canner. And I think that in her experiments that she did, it showed that it did very, very well. There was one instance where it didn't seem to do very well, didn't maintain the heat that it was required and the pressure that was required to be deemed 100% safe. And that was when she used a spaghetti sauce that was extremely thick and almost like chili. And it was specifically in the quart-sized jars, not necessarily in the pint-sized jars. And so I found that to be very interesting, and I keep that in mind. So when I make my spaghetti sauce now, I cut back the amount of meat I put in it so that there's more fluid, more liquid inside and less meat in it so that the heat can travel through more easily. My one caveat is if you're going to go with electric pressure canners, make sure that you've done as much research and really research the different types of testing, independent testing that has been done, not just by the manufacturer, but independent testing that's been done by folks. And a lot of them have been deemed to work, but there are some limitations that you might want to consider. And if those limitations are things that you commonly cook, you may want to then go with a manual canner or a stovetop canner. I really like the electric canner because it works just like an Instapot. I mean, it is so similar to an Instapot, it's silly. Now, all the preparation you have to do in advance of getting it in the jar is still the same. But once it goes into the canner, you hit a button or a couple buttons, and then you can walk away. I literally left the house and went on an errand, came back. It was already done. I came back like 3 hours later, guys, and it was done. It was cooled. It was ready to come out. It's just so easy. And for those of you who are kind of scared of the pressure canning process, getting an electric canner is going to get you over that fear, because the electric canners work very much like your Instapot or your crock pot, because they are one of those things that you just pop stuff in, you hit the buttons, you tell it how long, and it just does its thing and you don't have to intervene. Same holds true. It has safety mechanisms to keep it from like going nuts or anything like that. You can't mess it up. That's the cool thing. You really can't mess it up. It's not going to let you open the canner. It's not going to let you do anything you're not supposed to do. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to put a link down in the description along with my link to my Amazon store that has all my favorite preservation method items. But the one thing that's not going to be on there is going to be the freeze dryer. I highly recommend that if you are interested in a freeze dryer, they are expensive. This is something that you really need to take some time to think about whether the investment is worth it for you. It is worth it for me because I have a lot of vegetables that come out of the garden that I preserve, and I don't like the way the other ways of preserving them. And so I end up not eating them, and that just feels wasteful. But this has opened a whole new world for me. It's also super helpful because when we go on our RV trips, some foods just don't last very long, and our RV refrigerator is not something that I would consider dependable. So having whole meals and eggs like this, instead of bouncing down the road and breaking all our eggs, like this makes sense to me. This works and it tastes great. So if you are interested and it is, something that would work for you and your family, I would really love it, and it would help the channel so much that you would use my link down below to get your Harvest Right freeze dryer. It's at no extra cost to you, but they do give me a small percentage of the earnings. Now, the next question came from Diane and Ruth, and they asked about safe preserving resources. So when it comes to the freeze dryer, there are some freeze dry books, but to be honest, freeze drying is very similar to freezing in terms of preparation. You can pretty much freeze anything, right? Well, you can pretty much freeze dye anything. So I don't think that there's necessarily a book or a resource that you need for this. You stick it in there and you don't pull it out until it's completely dry, and then you package it. Now, and you can package it in two ways. You can package it in the Mylar jars. You can package it in a mason jar, and I use a vacuum sealer. I don't put this under water for water canning or anything. This just gets vacuum sealed, and that's it. Dehydrating, same kind of thing. They have some dehydrating book, but honestly, this is all based on touch. If you pull it out of your dehydrator and it's nice and dry and crispy, it's safe. It's gotten most of the liquid out. Make sure to store it in a way. Check on your things. Make sure that they're not getting sticky, stuck. But once you remove the water from stuff, it's a very difficult environment for bacteria to live in. The curing process, that's the same thing. Once they're completely dry and you bring them inside, check them once a month. Make sure that you don't see anything growing on the bottoms of your pumpkins, or, you don't see sprouting is okay. I get a lot of sprouting on my sweet potatoes, but that doesn't hurt anything. And your beans, you're just making sure that you kind of look through it and that they're still dry inside. You might want to use one of those silica packets just to make sure that it stays dry and the humidity around. And then your powders, you kind of want to shake them around and make sure they're not getting stuck together, because stuck means moisture. So these are easy ways. You're going to be really safe eating these as long as you make sure that they're crispy dry when you get them out, or that when you kind of look at them that they're maintaining shape, size, there's no soft spots, Same with the freezer. Once it goes in the freezer, you're just looking for freezer burn and things like that. And even freezer burn is not unsafe. It's more just nasty taste-wise. The ones that probably draw the most concern in terms of safety are these guys right here: fermentation, pressure canning, and water bath canning. So let's talk some of the resources I have. So when it comes to fermentation, there are books about fermenting that I like. But at the end of the day, the only really good test for fermentation is to open the jar, look at the top, and see if there's mold. If there's mold, some people will scrape it off. I'm of the world that I would dump it. If there's mold, something kind of went wrong. It's not like the acidic environment that it needs to be. And then the second step of testing your fermentation is to eat it. My first fermentation, I made vinegar, which was what I was intending to do. I made apple cider vinegar. And the thought of tasting vinegar that had been sitting underneath my cabinet for 6 months scared me to death. But guys, I'm here today. I'm alive. That's how it's made. Fermentation, whether it's making vinegar or making sauerkraut or anything else, you have to taste it. So smell, making sure that it smells tangy, sometimes yeasty, like sourdough and kefir kind of have that yeasty smell. This one kind of has like that tangy smell, almost like a vinegary smell kind of. And then you have to taste it. You take a small bite to taste and see what it tastes like. It should taste kind of pickly. That's kind of what it tastes like, kind of pickly. If you taste it and it just tastes salty, it's not done yet. If you taste it and it tastes like rotten, garbage, it's bad. You didn't put enough salt in it. But you're more than likely, you're not going to get sick from a small taste. You know, I'm not like taking a huge spoonful and eating it. I'm taking a small piece and I bite it and chew it in my mouth until I can determine the taste. And if it tastes bad, I spit it out. If it tastes okay, but not quite there, it's fine to swallow. It's not going to hurt you. And then, you know, if it tastes great, awesome. You know, I take the weight out, I take the vent cap off, I put a real lid on, and it goes in the refrigerator, and it's going to last a year in there. Canning is a different world. You do not want to taste anything if something has gone wrong in the canning world here. If your jars, I'm lifting it up by just the lid, if your jars cannot be lifted like this, I almost can't even lift that one because it's so heavy. The lids need to be intact. I mean, they have to be intact. That is one of the major ways to know that your contents of your jar are safe, is that these lids are intact. The other way to know is that you have followed to a T a trusted, scientifically determined recipe. There's a million recipes out on the internet on how to can things. We have rebel canners out there. I get it. They have been taught by their grandmother or their great grandmother. Their family's done it this way forever. I personally kind of lean towards the more conservative way of doing this. I would hate to ever accidentally make my husband or my family members sick because I took a shortcut or I followed a recipe that I know is not tested. So there's 3 resources for testing. There's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I'm going to put their link down below. They're a great resource. They're going to talk about all kinds of things. Ball, who makes the jars, also makes cookbooks, and all of their recipes are tested. They have a website, plus they have cookbooks. Those books are down in my Amazon store. All of those are tested and approved. And then the third place is I will look at other states have extension offices that actually do testing of their canned goods. And they do that specifically because maybe that area has a special recipe or a special vegetable that they grow that was never tested by the National Home Food Preservation or Ball or whatever, and it is just, you know, maybe something they've had trouble with in the past, and they want a tested recipe for the people or the folks in their area. And so they will do their own testing, and you have to kind of look for those one at a time. But you're looking for sites that have .edu, .org, not just like the .coms and the .nets. You're looking for places that are county extension offices that have done the testing and can detail the steps that were done with the tests. And then you can follow that recipe. That is your best bet, because if you go, and it's an awful situation that's happened to some folks, if you decide that you are not going to follow a recipe, or you're going to water bath can like potatoes that need to be pressure canned, and then you get somebody sick because when you open this jar, say the seal works well, you followed that recipe even though it wasn't approved, and you open it up and you smell it, and it smells fine, and then you dump it out and you even cook it for 10 minutes on the stove and you feed it to somebody, there is a potential that botulism is still in the food. Botulism cannot be seen or smelled. It is not something that is easily identifiable. The only way to know if it's in your jar is if you eat it, and the result of botulism exposure is very, very terrible. It is, for some people, life-threatening, and for other people, it's life-changing. So, I say all that not to scare the bejesus out of you, but to say that these guys are not as concerning because botulism doesn't like to live in a high-acid food. So if you want to start with water bathing and you're scared, water bathing is the way to go because it really can't live in here. It can't live in that kind of level of pH. What can live in here is mold, and mold we can see. So if you pop this jar open and there's mold on the top, you know you didn't get a good seal or you didn't get up to the heat that you were supposed to, and then you know to toss that out. But when it comes to low acid foods that need to be pressure canned, followed a specific recipe, there's no, you could open it up and it'll smell great, it'll taste great, you'll do all the right things, and you could get botulism. And the main reason, the number one reason for that, is you're not following a tested recipe. If you follow a tested recipe and you get a good seal, that you can lift this jar up by its seal itself and it will not release, then you are safe. I know it sounds scary. I've eaten a lot of canned food. I've eaten a lot of pressure canned food. I've made a lot of pressure canned food, and I have always felt completely safe, and we have never had an incident of any kind of food related illness because of the food that I cook or grow. It's because I follow a tested recipe, especially when it comes to pressure canning. When it comes to pressure canning, I don't mess around. So those are the resources that I think that you need to focus on when it comes to pressure canning. The rest of them, the risk is much lighter. And there are obvious things that will happen that you will know are not good things, like bugs or mold or wetness, and it gets soft and wet, or, mold is like the biggest one. I'm just going to go with mold. Funky taste, bad smells, those kinds of things. But this guy, this one's tricky because he doesn't smell bad. He doesn't look bad. He tastes pretty good. So, and by the way, if you use the electric pressure canner, once again, it does all of the mechanism for you. So as long as you find a trusted recipe, you follow the recipe and you put it in the electric pressure canner, it works great. Okay. The next question was from Future Folk and Clive, asking about storing white potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions, and garlic. Now, I don't have all of those here. Let's start with garlic, onions. Yeah, let's start with garlic and onions because I think those are very common. When we pull them out of the ground, the way that I like to do them is I will take a string and tie them and hang them somewhere, usually on my pool patio, because there's a lot of airflow and breeze, but they're under a cover so they're not getting rained on, and it's dapple light or at least shade in that area. And I usually leave them out there for 2 or 3 weeks until the entire stalk is dried up. Then you can cut the stalks off, or you can braid them together. I've done braiding. I think it's beautiful, and I think it really holds up well inside. And then you just bring it inside and it sits in your pantry. That is how you cure or take care of garlic and onions. Sweet potatoes cure a little bit differently. They like hot weather, hot, humid weather, which is not what everything else likes. Everything else likes kind of cool, dry weather. And you achieve that by, putting them under things or inside or whatever. But the sweet potatoes, they like it hot. They are a tropical food, so they really like hot weather. So what I do with my sweet potatoes is once I've dug them up, I don't brush the dirt off. The dirt is actually still on these. I don't take the dirt off until I'm ready to use them. And they go in my garage on a single layer, and I close my garage so there's not light coming in. And usually in most parts of Florida, regardless of the time of year, most of Florida, the garages stay pretty hot. And so I usually leave them out there depending on how hot it is in the garage. The hotter it is, the least time you need. So if it's super hot, it's 1 week in the garage like that. If it's super kind of cold, it might be 3 weeks in the garage. And what you're looking for is for that skin to be nice and hard and can't be scraped off, really. It's nice and tight and on there, and it's thick, and you can feel the difference from the time when you pull up a sweet potato out of the ground. You can almost rub the skin off of it. Once you've let it sit in that garage for 2-3 weeks, the skin is hard and tough, and that's what's going to keep it good for its remainder of its life. From there, once it's done its 2 weeks in the garage, laid out in the dark, nice hot, humid conditions, I bring it inside, I put it in a paper bag, and I put it in the pantry. I do the paper bag so that it is staying dark so it doesn't sprout. Now this one has tiny bits of sprouts that are starting to come, but it's almost a year old. These are almost a year old. So because of that, if they do sprout, it's not like a huge deal. You can use them to make your next year's slips, or you can just break the sprouts off, cut that piece off, and just eat it. It's completely fine. When it comes to white potatoes are incredibly hard to hold at room temperature here in Florida. We don't have cold rooms. Well, most of us don't have cold rooms, don't have basements, don't have cellars. We don't have places like that. To cure a white potato, what you want to do is you want to move it into, I usually move it into my house. Coldest room I have, which is my spare bedroom, because my spare bedroom, for some reason, the AC just vents into that thing, and it's at least 5 to 7 degrees colder in that room than anywhere else in the house. So I'll lay it out there. I cover it with a little cotton towel, and I let it sit there for 2 weeks, kind of like I do the sweet potatoes, but I want it in a cooler environment. Not cold, but cooler. After the 2 weeks, you'll have the same thing happen where the skin is tougher. Here's where things get tricky. Most people up north would then take those potatoes and put them in like a milk crate or something and cover them with, cardboard or something to keep them dark and put them down in a root cellar. Something around 40 to 50 degrees with a high humidity. We don't have that here. So what I do is I put them in a paper bag and I put them in my garage refrigerator, which is usually meant for drinks, and I bring the temperature of that refrigerator down to 50 degrees. And I can maintain it there for about 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. That is not as long as what our friends up north usually get, unfortunately. So the other thing that I do is I start reverting to freeze drying it. I can freeze dry hash browns. I can freeze dry mashed potatoes. I can pressure can herbed potatoes. I can pressure can, cut up hash brown potatoes. You know what I mean? Like there's a ton of ways that I can prepare them. I can dehydrate potatoes, right? And make a potato powder or a potato flour. So usually what I do is I move them into the refrigerator in the paper bag. I check them at least once a month. And when I start to see some of them turning, I pull them all out and I preserve them in one method or another. Next up is Pam, and she wanted to know about cabbage, kale, collards, and sauerkraut. Now we talked about sauerkraut and how to make sauerkraut, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that. But there are other ways that I preserve cabbage, kale and collards. And the other ways is freeze drying. I make a freeze-dried green powder. That's actually what this is right here. All of those plants that came out of my garden where they produced their cauliflower head or they produced their cabbage head and they had all these extra leaves and my compost tumbler was full, I blanched them, I froze them, or I freeze-dried them, and then I powdered them into a green powder. This is like a vitamin powder. It's awesome. This is a great way to, use up this little jar was like 1 tray of greens. It was a huge amount of greens. And it powders down to like almost nothing, which I think is really cool. You can put this in soups, salads, smoothies, anything. You can sneak it into breads. I snuck in zucchini flour into a banana bread. You can sneak this stuff into all kinds of things, spaghetti sauce. Get your kids some extra vitamins. And when you freeze dry it, most of the vitamins stay with it. So that's a cool way. Another way that I've done is I've actually canned collards before. I canned collards. Not my favorite. I like fresh collard greens, but they do work. And in a pinch, if you have a lot, that's a cool way to do it. And you are canning them. They're pressure canned. All greens are pressure canned. And then the other way you could do it is freezing. So we have our celery here. I do the same thing with my greens, and I did that. I have some that are powdered. I have some that are whole freeze-dried. I have some that are canned. And then my way that I like them a lot is I will blanch them and then dry them off, and I will freeze them in a bag, a huge gallon bag of greens, chopped up as much as I can, but still big pieces. And whenever a recipe calls for spinach, like a pasta recipe or whatever, I will take a scoop or handful out of my bag from the freezer, drop it straight into the recipe on the stove, cooks down in a matter of minutes, and I have greens all year round that way. So those are different ways that you can use your cabbage, kale, collards. It works great. Samlita and Linda wanted to know how I use my dehydrator. Since I got my freeze dryer, I use my dehydrator a lot less, but my main ways of using it is herbs, although I'm probably going to switch my herbs over to the freeze dryer because it just maintains more of that fresh taste. The dehydrator mutes a lot of the taste, but I may still do my teas that way. Because it is a little bit faster, a little bit easier. In tea, you know, the taste kind of blends together, especially when you do tea blends like what I do. So tea, I'll definitely continue to dehydrate. Fruit leathers, they're going to be much better from the dehydrator than any of the other mechanisms. Snacks like fruit chips, apples, those kinds of things. Those are great to dehydrate. What else have I dehydrated? Oh, beef jerky. How could I forget beef jerky? Beef jerky is a great dehydrated snack. That is an awesome snack, and you could do that in these little mini dehydrators. You can get a giant dehydrator too, but I like my little one. It's inexpensive. It works for me. You know, it doesn't do a significant amount, but it does enough. So beef jerky would be a phenomenal thing. I do my sun-dried tomatoes in the dehydrator. I think those are absolutely fantastic in there. Those are mainly what I use. And then I know that Linda. I know that Linda was asking to use the oven as the dehydrator. And I'm thinking probably pretty soon I'm gonna do one of those day in the lives where I do that. I'm hesitant just because a dehydrator needs to run for a long period of time depending on what you're using. And so let's say we're going to do sun-dried tomatoes, right? It needs to run for like 8 to 12 to 16 hours. And I hate to use my oven for that long because when you use your oven, you have to crack it open to allow, you know, the moisture to get out, as well as the fact that ovens do not go down as low as a dehydrator, or most ovens. My dehydrator can go down to 100 degrees, but my oven can only go down to 200 degrees. 200 is usually much hotter than what most items will dehydrate well with. I am planning on doing it. I'm just trying to figure out what would be the most. I might do fruit leather, because I think fruit leather, you can get away with it and it'll dehydrate in a much quicker period of time. You know what? Now that I say that, you got me thinking fruit leather. So maybe we're going to save some of our strawberries and I can make a fruit leather in the oven to show you how it dehydrates. Because that would probably only take 4 to 6 hours. So that would be good. Okay. Keep an eye out, Linda. We're going to get that done for you. Then we have HGR goats. Somebody who absolutely loves goats. How do you cook cassava? So cassava, or there's a few different root vegetables down here. There's a type of yam, there's taro, there's cassava, there's sweet potatoes, of course. But all of those are root crops down here in Florida, or in the tropics, really, anywhere in the tropics or in warm climates. Cassava is a great one because cassava creates huge roots, and you are talking about a no-nonsense plant. This plant does not care. It grows super well. It doesn't need a lot. It just grows, right? And then you tear it up and out, and you have these huge roots that you would use very similarly to a potato or a sweet potato. I kind of think of them as somewhere in between. Your taste is different for everyone, but somewhere in between the two, white potato and sweet potato, is where cassava lives. And it's a larger size root usually, and you're going to use it exactly like you would use a potato. Chop it up, you can boil it, you can mash it, you can fry it, you can do pretty much all the things that you can do with white potatoes or sweet potatoes. It has a slightly sweeter taste than a sweet potato does, or sorry, a white potato does, but it's not as sweet as a sweet potato. So something to consider there. Another cool thing that people do with cassava is they make flour, which technically is part of that tapioca starch family. So if you're more gluten-free or something like that, the tapioca starch is a way to thicken up foods or bread products or something like that. And that actually comes from the cassava plant. So if you grow cassava, you can grind it down, dehydrate it, freeze dry it, whatever you like, and make a flour substitute. I hope you had fun learning all of the different ways that I preserve and store my harvest. If you want to learn more, I have an entire playlist on everything that I have ever recorded in terms of my preservation methods, including how I water bath can, how I pressure can, how I freeze dry, how I dehydrate, how I make spices, and everything in between. I haven't done one on fermenting yet, but I will definitely get around to that. But I'll put that playlist at the end of this video so that you can check out all of those videos. I had a great time with you guys today. Happy gardening and happy preserving.